In the long memory of civilizations, some empires blaze briefly, while others linger like winter, refusing to release their grip upon history. Russia belongs to the second kind. Its story is not simply about conquest or kings, but endurance across centuries of invasion, collapse, rebirth, and relentless ambition. Across the northern forests of Eurasia stretches a land so vast that distance itself becomes a historical force. Rivers flow for thousands of miles. Winters swallow armies. Forests conceal peoples and cultures that for centuries lived beyond the reach of organized states. Yet from this wilderness emerged one of history's most enduring powers. The question that begins Russia's story is deceptively simple. How did scattered tribes living along cold rivers become the foundation of an empire that would dominate half a continent? To answer it, we must travel back more than 1,000 years, to a time when the word Russia did not yet exist. In the early centuries of the first millennium, Eastern Europe was not a unified realm but a mosaic of Slavic tribes. These communities lived along waterways that cut through forests and marshlands. Their lives revolved around agriculture, hunting, trade, and survival against harsh climates. There were no emperors here, no monumental cities, no central authority. Instead, loose tribal structures governed daily life. Among these tribes were the Ilmen Slavs near the northern lakes, the Krivich along the upper Volga, and the Polans along the fertile banks of the Dnieper River. Each group maintained its own customs, alliances, and rivalries, but geography was already shaping their future. The rivers of Eastern Europe formed a vast network linking the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. These waterways would become the arteries of commerce connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium. Where trade flows, power eventually follows. By the 8th and 9th centuries, new actors appeared along these routes. Scandinavian adventurers known to history as the Varangians. To the Slavic tribes they encountered, these northern warriors were both raiders and merchants. They traveled in sleek longships, navigating rivers that connected distant worlds. With them came new forms of organization, warfare, and leadership. According to the ancient chronicle known as the Primary Chronicle, the Slavic tribes eventually invited these Varangian leaders to rule over them. The chronicle famously records their request: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." Whether legend or truth, the invitation symbolizes a turning point. In the year 862, a Varangian leader named Rurik established rule in the northern city of Novgorod. His dynasty would become the founding line of what historians call the Kievan Rus. Rurik's arrival did not immediately create an empire, but it planted the seed of centralized authority in a region that had long lacked it. After Rurik's death, power passed to his successor Oleg. Oleg would become the architect of something far more ambitious. Moving southward from Novgorod, Oleg captured the strategic city of Kiev around the year 882. Located along the Dnieper River, Kiev controlled the vital trade route linking Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire. From this city emerged the first political entity recognizable as the ancestor of Russia, the Kievan Rus. Kiev was not merely a fortress or trading post. Under Oleg's rule, it became the center of a growing federation of Slavic and Finnic tribes united under Varangian leadership. Trade with Byzantium brought wealth. Silver coins from distant lands flowed into its markets. Furs, honey, wax, and slaves moved southward along the rivers. In return came luxury goods, cultural influences, and new ideas about governance and religion. The rulers of Kiev were not yet emperors, but they were learning how power worked. Oleg himself demonstrated this ambition dramatically when he led a campaign against Constantinople in 907. According to chronicles, his fleet appeared before the massive walls of the Byzantine capital, forcing the empire to negotiate favorable trade agreements. Whether embellished or accurate, the story illustrates a new reality. The Rus were no longer scattered tribes. They had become a political force. After Oleg came Igor, whose reign revealed the challenges of governing a diverse and expanding realm. Tribute collection from distant tribes often sparked resistance. In 945, Igor was killed during a rebellion by the Drevlians, a reminder that authority in this young state remained fragile. But history often turns on unlikely figures. Following Igor's death, power passed temporarily to his widow, Princess Olga. Olga's rule stands as one of the most dramatic episodes in early Russian history. When the Drevlians proposed marriage to consolidate power, she responded not with diplomacy but calculated vengeance. Chronicles recount how she buried emissaries alive, burned enemy cities, and reasserted control over rebellious tribes. Yet Olga was more than a ruler of revenge. She introduced administrative reforms that strengthened tribute systems and improved governance. Even more significantly, she became the first ruler of the Rus to convert to Christianity after visiting Constantinople. Her conversion planted the seeds of a transformation that would reshape Russian civilization. That transformation would arrive during the reign of her grandson, Vladimir. By the late 10th century, Vladimir the Great faced a strategic choice. The Rus realm stood at the crossroads of multiple cultures and religions. Islam spread through neighboring regions. Judaism flourished among trading communities. Western Christianity expanded from Europe. But the greatest influence remained the Byzantine Empire. According to legend, Vladimir sent envoys to observe the religions of neighboring peoples. When they witnessed the splendor of Byzantine worship in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, they reportedly declared, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." In 988, Vladimir accepted baptism and declared Christianity the official religion of the Rus. The consequences were enormous. Pagan idols were destroyed. The people of Kiev were baptized en masse in the Dnieper River. Orthodox Christianity became the spiritual foundation of the emerging civilization. Religion did more than reshape faith. It connected the Rus culturally and politically to Byzantium, the most sophisticated empire of the medieval world. Greek clergy introduced literacy, art, architecture, and theological traditions that profoundly influenced Russian culture. Stone churches replaced wooden shrines. Written law codes began to emerge. Icons and liturgy defined spiritual life. Through religion, the Rus entered the broader world of Christian civilization. Vladimir's son Yaroslav the Wise continued this process during the 11th century. Under Yaroslav's rule, Kiev reached the height of its power and prosperity. He commissioned grand cathedrals, including the magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral. He established schools and libraries. He codified the first written law code of the Rus, known as the Russkaya Pravda. Kiev became one of the largest cities in Europe. Foreign merchants crowded its markets. Diplomatic marriages connected its ruling dynasty with royal houses across the continent. For a brief moment in history, the Kievan Rus stood as a thriving medieval state. Yet beneath its prosperity lay a structural weakness. Power remained divided among members of the ruling dynasty. Instead of a single line of succession, lands were distributed among princely relatives. This system encouraged rivalry and fragmentation. After Yaroslav's death in 1054, disputes among princes intensified. Cities such as Novgorod, Vladimir, and Suzdal grew increasingly independent. The unity of the Kievan state slowly began to unravel. Trade patterns also shifted. As new routes developed and political instability increased, Kiev's central importance declined. Regional centers rose in influence. Princes competed for power, wealth, and legitimacy. The once unified Rus began splintering into rival principalities. This fragmentation weakened the political structure that had taken centuries to build. But an even greater threat loomed far beyond the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe. Across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a new empire was rising with terrifying speed. Led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies had already conquered enormous territories stretching from China to Persia. Their military system was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. Disciplined cavalry, devastating mobility, relentless strategy. By the early 13th century, their expansion approached the borders of the Rus principalities. The princes of the fragmented Rus states did not yet understand the magnitude of the danger. They continued their rivalries, fighting one another for territory and prestige. In 1223, a coalition of Rus princes confronted Mongol forces at the Battle of the Khalkha River. The result was catastrophic. The Mongols annihilated the Rus army with brutal efficiency. Yet after the battle, the invaders withdrew eastward. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm had passed, but the Mongols had only been scouting. 2 decades later, they would return with overwhelming force. In 1237, the Mongol invasion began in full. Cities burned, armies collapsed. The once great network of Rus principalities faced a threat unlike any they had ever known. The age of Kievan glory was ending, and a darker chapter of Russian history was about to begin. When the Mongols returned to the lands of the Rus in the 13th century, they did not arrive as wandering raiders or exploratory scouts. They came as an organized force of conquest, representing one of the most formidable military machines the world had ever seen. Behind them stretched the growing empire founded by Genghis Khan, an empire built upon speed, discipline, and terror as instruments of domination. By the 1230s, command of the Western Mongol armies had fallen to Badu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. Under his leadership, marched tens of thousands of cavalrymen hardened by campaigns across Asia. These warriors traveled with astonishing mobility, their horses capable of covering vast distances while surviving on the grasslands that stretched endlessly before them. To the princes of the Rus, whose political divisions had weakened their collective strength, this approaching storm was both unfamiliar and underestimated. The invasion began in winter. In December 1237, Mongol forces struck the Principality of Ryazan. Their siege tactics combined relentless bombardment with psychological warfare. Envoys demanded submission and tribute. When the city refused, the Mongols surrounded it with siege engines and waves of archers. Ryazan fell within days. The chronicles describe scenes of devastation: walls breached, fires raging, civilians slaughtered, and survivors driven into captivity. It was not merely a military defeat, but a demonstration intended to shatter resistance before it began. From Ryazan, the Mongol armies moved north and west. City after city collapsed beneath the assault. Kolomna burned. Moscow, then only a small settlement, was destroyed. In February 1238, the great city of Vladimir, once the center of a powerful Rus principality, fell after fierce resistance. Its cathedral became a final refuge for civilians before flames consumed it. The Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. Rus princes attempted to gather forces to resist. Yet their fragmented political system made unified defense almost impossible. Armies assembled too slowly, alliances faltered, and commanders lacked coordination against an enemy whose strategy relied on speed and deception. At the Battle of the Sit River in 1238, Mongol forces annihilated another Rus army. Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir was killed in the fighting. The northern principalities lay exposed. Yet despite the scale of destruction, the Mongols temporarily withdrew eastward after their first wave of campaigns. This pause offered the surviving Rus cities a fragile moment of recovery. But Badu Khan had not finished. In 1240, the Mongol armies returned, now targeting the historic heart of the Rus civilization: Kiev. Once the shining capital of the Kievan state, Kiev had already declined from its earlier prosperity. Yet its symbolic importance remained immense. The Mongols surrounded the city late in the year. Defenders fought desperately from the walls. Siege engines battered fortifications while Mongol archers rained arrows upon the defenders. Eventually, the walls collapsed under sustained assault. In December 1240, Kiev fell. The destruction was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with bodies, churches reduced to ruins, and survivors enslaved or scattered. The once great center of Rus civilization had been shattered. With Kiev destroyed, the Mongols continued their march westward into Eastern and Central Europe, defeating Hungarian and Polish armies before eventually withdrawing toward the steppe. But for the lands of the Rus, the conquest had already been decided. A new political order emerged. Historians would later call it the Mongol yoke. Rather than directly governing every conquered territory, the Mongols established a powerful khanate known as the Golden Horde. Its capital eventually rose at Sarai along the lower Volga River, where steppe traditions merged with imperial administration. From this center, Mongol rulers controlled vast territories stretching across Eurasia. The Rus principalities were not annexed in the conventional sense. Instead, they became tributary states, required to acknowledge Mongol authority and deliver regular payments of tribute. Princes retained their positions but only with Mongol approval. To rule, they had to travel to the horde's court and receive a yarlik, an official charter confirming their authority. Without it, their legitimacy could be challenged by rivals. This system created a new dynamic. Rus princes were now both rulers of their own lands and servants of the Mongol Khans. Many despised the arrangement, but resistance was rarely successful. The Mongols possessed overwhelming military superiority and enforced their authority with ruthless efficiency. Yet the Mongol domination was not solely destructive. Over time, it reshaped the political development of the Rus lands in unexpected ways. Trade networks expanded across the Mongol Empire, connecting Europe with Asia through routes that allowed merchants to travel with relative safety under Mongol protection. Cultural exchange occurred along these routes. Administrative practices introduced by the Mongols influenced governance among the Rus princes. Most importantly, the period of Mongol rule altered the balance of power among the surviving principalities. One city in particular began to rise under these new conditions: Moscow. At the time of the Mongol invasion, Moscow was little more than a modest settlement surrounded by forests. It had been destroyed during the Mongol campaigns and rebuilt afterward, but geography favored it. Situated along important trade routes and protected by dense woodland, Moscow was relatively secure compared to exposed southern cities. Its rulers also proved politically astute. In the early 14th century, Prince Ivan I of Moscow, later known as Ivan Khalida, adopted a strategy of cooperation with the Mongol authorities. Rather than openly resisting the horde, he worked within its system to strengthen his own position. Ivan gained the trust of the Mongol Khans and secured the right to collect tribute from other Rus principalities on their behalf. This privilege was extraordinarily valuable. By controlling tribute collection, Moscow accumulated wealth and influence. Rival princes often found themselves financially dependent on Moscow's growing power. Ivan used these resources to expand Moscow's territory through purchase, diplomacy, and occasional force. Gradually, the city emerged as a political center. The Russian Orthodox Church also played a role in Moscow's rise. In 1325, the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church moved his residence from Vladimir to Moscow, enhancing the city's spiritual prestige. Religion and politics became intertwined. Moscow began presenting itself as the protector of Orthodox Christianity within the Mongol-controlled lands. Over time, this combination of economic power, religious authority, and political maneuvering elevated Moscow above its rivals. Yet Mongol authority still overshadowed all. Rus princes remained subordinate to the Khans of the Golden Horde. Tribute continued to flow eastward. The memory of Mongol devastation remained a powerful reminder of the consequences of rebellion. But history rarely remains static. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde itself began to weaken. Internal struggles among Mongol leaders fractured the unity that had once defined their empire. Competing khans fought for control, destabilizing the political structure that had maintained authority over the Rus' lands. The weakening of the horde created new opportunities. In Moscow, a prince named Dmitry Ivanovich sensed that the moment for resistance might finally be approaching. Dmitry, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, inherited the Principality of Moscow in 1359. His early reign unfolded amid the growing instability of the Golden Horde. Rather than remaining entirely submissive, Dmitry began strengthening Moscow's military capabilities. He fortified the city with stone walls, creating one of the first stone Kremlins in Rus territory. He also worked to unite other principalities under Moscow's leadership. This was a difficult task. Centuries of rivalry had created deep mistrust among Rus princes, but the weakening of Mongol authority created an incentive for cooperation. The moment of confrontation arrived in 1380. A powerful Mongol commander named Mamai sought to reassert dominance over the Rus lands and marched westward with a large army. Dmitry gathered a coalition of Rus forces and advanced to meet him. The armies clashed on the Kulikovo field near the Don River. The battle that followed became one of the most legendary moments in Russian history. Rus warriors fought with fierce determination, driven by both political ambition and religious conviction. According to chronicles, Orthodox monks even joined the battlefield. After hours of brutal combat, Dmitry's forces achieved a decisive victory. For the first time, a united Rus army had defeated a major Mongol force in open battle. The victory at Kulikovo did not immediately end Mongol dominance. 2 years later, another Mongol leader, Toktamish, launched a retaliatory campaign and sacked Moscow. Tribute payments resumed. Yet the psychological impact of Kulikovo was immense. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered. Among the Rus people, a new sense of possibility emerged. Moscow's prestige grew dramatically after the battle. Dmitry Donskoy became a symbol of resistance and unity. Over the following decades, Moscow continued expanding its influence. Other principalities gradually fell under its authority through alliances, marriages, and territorial acquisitions. The Golden Horde, meanwhile, continued weakening. Internal conflicts divided its leadership. Trade disruptions reduced its revenues. Regional powers emerged along its borders. By the early 15th century, the political landscape of Eastern Europe was shifting. Moscow had become the strongest of the Rus principalities, but the final break from Mongol domination had not yet arrived. That moment would come during the reign of a prince whose ambition matched the scale of the land he sought to control. His name was Ivan. History would remember him as Ivan the Great. Under his rule, the long shadow of Mongol power would finally begin to fade, and a new Russian state would emerge from centuries of fragmentation and foreign domination. The age of princes was ending. The age of the Russian state was about to begin. For nearly 2 centuries, the princes of the Rus had lived beneath the shadow of the Mongol Khans. Tribute flowed eastward, political authority required Mongol approval, and the memory of burned cities lingered in the collective consciousness of the people. Yet empires rarely remain dominant forever. The Golden Horde, once the western pillar of the vast Mongol world, had begun to fracture under the weight of internal rivalries, economic decline, and shifting trade routes. In this moment of weakening authority, the Principality of Moscow continued its steady ascent. At the center of that ascent stood a ruler whose ambition extended far beyond the modest boundaries of his inherited lands. Ivan III of Moscow, later known as Ivan the Great, came to power in 1462. By the time of his death more than 4 decades later, he would transform Moscow from a regional principality into the nucleus of a centralized Russian state. But the world Ivan inherited was still divided. Across the former lands of the Kievan Rus existed numerous rival principalities. Novgorod remained a wealthy republic governed by merchant elites. Tver stood as Moscow's long-standing competitor. Smaller territories maintained varying degrees of autonomy, each ruled by its own princes and boyar elites. Above them, all lingered the authority of the Golden Horde. Ivan understood that true independence required two achievements: the unification of the Rus lands under Moscow's authority, and the removal of Mongol dominance that had endured for generations. His strategy combined diplomacy, calculated aggression, and patient consolidation of power. The first major challenge lay in Novgorod. Unlike most Rus territories, Novgorod operated as a commercial republic. Its government was dominated by wealthy merchants who maintained extensive trade connections with Northern Europe through the Hanseatic League. The city valued its independence and resisted the growing authority of Moscow. Novgorod's leaders even explored alliances with Lithuania, a powerful state whose influence stretched across large portions of Eastern Europe. To Ivan, such alliances represented a direct threat. In 1471, tensions erupted into open conflict. Moscow's army marched against Novgorod and defeated its forces at the Battle of Shelin River. Though the city retained some autonomy after this defeat, its independence had been severely weakened. Ivan moved carefully in the following years, waiting for the right opportunity to eliminate Novgorod's political independence entirely. That opportunity came in 1478. Moscow's forces entered the city and formally annexed it into the growing Muscovite state. The famous Vech Bell of Novgorod, which had long symbolized the city's republican government, was removed and transported to Moscow. The message was unmistakable. Independent rule among the Rus lands was coming to an end. Ivan pursued similar policies toward other principalities. Through inheritance, purchase, diplomacy, and occasional military pressure, Moscow absorbed neighboring territories including Rostov, Yaroslavl, and eventually the rival Principality of Tver in 1485. Each acquisition expanded Moscow's authority while reducing the fragmented political structure that had defined the region for centuries. As these territories fell under Moscow's control, Ivan began reshaping the institutions of governance. Traditional princely autonomy gradually disappeared. Local rulers were replaced or subordinated to officials loyal to Moscow. A centralized administrative system slowly began to take form. The boyars, the powerful noble class of the Rus lands, remained influential but increasingly dependent on the Grand Prince's favor. This process marked the early stages of Russian autocracy. Ivan was not merely gathering territory. He was building a new political order. Yet one obstacle remained before Moscow could claim full sovereignty. The Golden Horde still demanded tribute. Although its power had diminished, the symbolic significance of Mongol authority continued to overshadow the Rus princes. Ivan decided the time had come to challenge that authority. In 1480, tensions escalated between Moscow and the Mongol ruler Akhmet Khan. Akhmet sought to reassert Mongol control and marched westward with an army toward the lands of Moscow. Ivan mobilized his forces in response. The two armies eventually faced one another along the banks of the Ugra River. For weeks they remained in a tense standoff. Neither side launched a decisive attack. The approaching winter and logistical challenges began to strain the Mongol position. Eventually, Akhmet Khan withdrew his forces. Though no major battle had occurred, the outcome carried enormous historical significance. The withdrawal effectively ended Mongol domination over the Rus lands. After more than 2 centuries, the era known as the Mongol yoke had come to an end. Ivan III now ruled an independent state. The implications of this moment extended far beyond military independence. It allowed Moscow to redefine its identity and its place in the broader political world. One of the most symbolic developments occurred through Ivan's marriage. In 1472, he married Sophia Paleologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. The Byzantine Empire had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, ending 1,000 years of imperial rule centered in Constantinople. Yet Byzantine cultural and religious traditions continued to influence Orthodox Christian communities. Sophia's arrival in Moscow carried immense symbolic weight. Through her lineage, Moscow could claim a connection to the legacy of Byzantium. This connection soon evolved into a powerful ideological concept. If Constantinople had been the second Rome, then Moscow might be seen as its successor. The idea of Moscow as the third Rome began circulating among clerics and political thinkers. According to this belief, Moscow had inherited the mantle of Orthodox Christian leadership following the fall of Constantinople. Ivan embraced this symbolism. The double-headed eagle, an emblem associated with Byzantine imperial authority, became a symbol of the Russian state. Court ceremonies grew more elaborate. The title of the ruler evolved as well. Ivan increasingly referred to himself as sovereign of all Rus. Though the title of Tsar would become official later, the foundations of imperial ideology were already forming. Architecture also reflected this transformation. Ivan commissioned the reconstruction of Moscow's Kremlin using Italian architects who introduced Renaissance influences into Russian design. New cathedrals, palaces, and fortified walls rose within the Kremlin complex, transforming it into a powerful symbol of centralized authority. Moscow was no longer merely a regional city. It was becoming the capital of a rising state. Yet Ivan's consolidation of power did not occur without resistance. Many boyars feared the growing authority of the Grand Prince. Some rival princes resented the loss of their independence. Ivan addressed these challenges with a combination of political pressure and institutional reform. In 1497, he introduced a new legal code known as the Sudebnik. This code standardized legal procedures across the expanding state and strengthened central authority over local governance. It also limited the mobility of peasants by restricting the times during which they could leave their landlords. Though not yet full serfdom, this law marked an early step toward the system that would later dominate Russian rural life. The Sudebnik reflected a broader pattern. Ivan's state prioritized order, hierarchy, and control. The chaotic fragmentation of earlier centuries was being replaced by a disciplined political structure centered on Moscow. By the end of Ivan's reign, the transformation was unmistakable. The territory under Moscow's authority had more than tripled. The rival principalities had been absorbed. The Mongol tribute system had ended. A centralized government was emerging. Russia, though the term was still evolving, had begun to take shape as a unified state. Yet the foundations Ivan built would soon face new tests. Centralization created powerful enemies among the nobility. Expansion brought the state into contact with new frontiers and new threats. Most importantly, the concentration of authority in the hands of a single ruler raised a question that would define Russian politics for centuries. How absolute should that authority become? Ivan III's successors would push the boundaries of autocratic power even further. Among them would rise a ruler whose name would become synonymous with both greatness and terror. His reign would expand Russia's territory dramatically while unleashing violence that shocked even his contemporaries. History would remember him as Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. Under his rule, the Russian state would evolve into an empire in ambition, if not yet in title. But the price of that transformation would be paid in blood, fear, and a legacy of power that would shape Russia for centuries to come. When Ivan III died in 1505, he left behind a state that had been fundamentally transformed. Moscow was no longer merely one principality among many. It had become the center of a unified political structure stretching across vast territories once divided by rival dynasties. The Mongol shadow had lifted, the authority of the Grand Prince had expanded, and the idea of a centralized Russian state had taken root. Yet what Ivan III created was still fragile. The institutions of power were young, the loyalties of the nobility uncertain, and the vast lands under Moscow's rule remained difficult to govern. The future of the state would depend upon rulers capable of maintaining unity while confronting the internal tensions that centralization had produced. Ivan's immediate successor, his son Vasily III, inherited both the opportunities and the challenges of this expanding state. Vasily III ruled from 1505 to 1533. His reign did not carry the dramatic symbolism of his father's achievements, but it played a crucial role in continuing the process of consolidation that had begun under Ivan III. Through careful diplomacy and military pressure, Vasily further expanded Moscow's control over remaining independent territories. One of his most significant victories came in 1510 when the Principality of Pskov, another semi-independent republic with strong trading traditions, was absorbed into the Muscovite state. The event followed a pattern similar to the earlier annexation of Novgorod. Local political institutions were dismantled. The traditional Vech assembly was abolished. Noble families who resisted Moscow's authority were relocated or subdued. Through these actions, Vasily ensured that the patchwork political order of the old Rus lands continued dissolving into a centralized monarchy. Another long-standing rival, the Principality of Ryazan, was incorporated into Moscow's realm in 1521. By the end of Vasily's reign, the territorial unification of the core Russian lands was largely complete, but Vasily faced one persistent problem. He lacked an heir. For years, his marriage to his first wife produced no children. In a controversial move that shocked many members of the Orthodox clergy, Vasily divorced her and remarried in hopes of securing the future of the dynasty. In 1530, his second wife, Elena Glinskaya, gave birth to a son. The child was named Ivan. No one could have predicted that this boy would grow to become one of the most infamous rulers in world history. When Vasily III died in 1533, the boy Ivan was only 3 years old. His youth plunged the state into a period of political instability. Because Ivan was too young to rule, power fell into the hands of regents and competing noble families known as boyars. These powerful aristocrats had long played influential roles within the Muscovite court, but now they saw an opportunity to expand their control. Elena Glinskaya, Ivan's mother, initially assumed the regency and attempted to maintain authority. During her brief rule, she introduced monetary reforms that standardized the currency system across the realm, an important step in strengthening the state's economic foundations. Yet her position remained precarious. In 1538, she died suddenly, possibly poisoned. With her death, the boy Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were left effectively orphaned within the Kremlin. The following years would shape Ivan's personality in ways that profoundly influenced the future of Russia. Boyar factions competed ruthlessly for power. Intrigue, conspiracies, and shifting alliances dominated court politics. The young prince witnessed nobles humiliating members of his family, seizing property, and manipulating government institutions for their own benefit. Historical accounts describe Ivan growing up surrounded by violence, neglect, and humiliation. He watched as boyars insulted his authority while pretending to serve him. He saw loyal servants imprisoned or executed by rival factions. The environment bred suspicion and resentment. According to chroniclers, Ivan began exhibiting disturbing behavior even in childhood. He reportedly took pleasure in acts of cruelty against animals and displayed bursts of violent anger toward those around him. These stories, though perhaps exaggerated by later historians, reflect the atmosphere of instability that surrounded the young ruler. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan formally assumed power. His coronation marked a moment of extraordinary symbolic importance. For the first time in Russian history, a ruler was crowned not merely as Grand Prince but as Tsar of all Rus. The title derived from the word Caesar, linking the Russian monarchy to the imperial traditions of Rome and Byzantium. The coronation ceremony took place within Moscow's Cathedral of the Dormition, where religious rituals blended with political symbolism. The message was unmistakable. Russia now possessed a ruler who claimed imperial authority. The boy who had endured years of manipulation by the boyars was now determined to reshape the balance of power. Yet the early years of Ivan's reign were surprisingly constructive. During the late 1540s and early 1550s, Ivan worked with a group of reform-minded advisors known as the Chosen Council. Together, they initiated a series of reforms designed to strengthen the administrative structure of the state. A new law code, the Sudebnik of 1550, expanded upon earlier legislation and improved judicial procedures. Local government reforms introduced elected officials in certain regions to reduce corruption. Military organization was strengthened through the creation of the streltsy, a permanent standing infantry armed with firearms. Church councils addressed religious practices and clarified orthodox doctrine. These reforms represented an effort to modernize governance while consolidating central authority. Ivan also pursued ambitious military campaigns. To the east lay the remnants of Mongol successor states that had emerged after the fragmentation of the Golden Horde. Among them were the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. These states controlled key positions along the Volga River and posed both strategic and economic challenges to Moscow's ambitions. In 1552, Ivan launched a massive campaign against Kazan. The siege lasted several months and involved advanced artillery tactics rarely seen in earlier Russian warfare. When Kazan finally fell, it marked a decisive expansion of Russian territory into the Volga region. 4 years later, Astrakhan was conquered as well. With these victories, Moscow gained control of the entire Volga trade route, opening access to the Caspian Sea and expanding Russian influence deep into former Mongol territories. The victories transformed Russia from a regional power into a rapidly expanding state, but success did not bring stability to Ivan's mind. In 1560, his beloved wife Anastasia died. Ivan believed she had been poisoned by boyar conspirators. Whether true or not, the event triggered a profound psychological transformation. The ruler who had once pursued reform began descending into suspicion and paranoia. Ivan increasingly viewed the nobility as traitors plotting against him. His response would become one of the most terrifying experiments in political control ever attempted in Europe. In 1565, he created the Oprichnina. This policy divided the Russian state into 2 separate territories. One portion remained under traditional administration. The other, the Oprichnina, fell directly under Ivan's personal control. Within this domain, Ivan commanded a special force known as the Oprichniki. Clad in black robes and riding black horses, these men functioned as a secret police loyal only to the Tsar. They carried gruesome symbols of their authority, including dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles, signifying their mission to sniff out and sweep away treason. The Oprichniki unleashed a campaign of terror across the land. Boyar families were arrested, tortured, and executed. Property was confiscated. Entire towns suspected of disloyalty were devastated. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in 1570 when Ivan accused the wealthy city of Novgorod of plotting betrayal. His forces descended upon the city and conducted a brutal purge that lasted weeks. Thousands of residents were killed. Churches were looted. The once great commercial center never fully recovered. Through terror, Ivan succeeded in breaking the political power of many noble families. But the consequences for the country were devastating. Agricultural production declined. Trade networks suffered disruption. Fear spread throughout the population. At the same time, Russia faced growing threats from external enemies. The Livonian War, which Ivan launched in 1558 to gain access to the Baltic Sea, initially appeared promising but soon turned disastrous. A coalition of European powers, including Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, intervened against Russia. Years of costly warfare drained the state's resources and ended without achieving the desired access to the Baltic. As the years passed, Ivan's rule grew increasingly erratic. In 1581, during a violent argument, he struck his own son and heir with a staff, fatally wounding him. The tragedy left the dynasty without a strong successor. When Ivan IV died in 1584, Russia was larger than it had ever been before. The conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan had opened vast eastern territories. Russian explorers were already beginning to push into the forests and rivers of Siberia. Yet the internal damage inflicted by years of terror and war left the state weakened. The institutions of power were unstable. Economic hardship afflicted much of the population, and the future of the ruling dynasty had become uncertain. The era of Ivan the Terrible had expanded Russia's borders dramatically, but it had also planted the seeds of chaos. In the years that followed his death, the fragile structure of the state would begin to crack. Soon Russia would enter one of the darkest periods in its history, a time of famine, rebellion, and competing claims to the throne. A time remembered simply as the time of troubles. When Ivan IV died in 1584, the vast realm he left behind stood at a dangerous crossroads. Russia's territory had expanded dramatically during his reign, stretching along the Volga and opening the path toward Siberia. Yet the internal damage inflicted by decades of terror, political purges, and exhausting wars had weakened the foundations of the state. The problem was not only institutional, it was dynastic. Ivan's surviving heir, Fedor I, was ill-prepared to rule. Fedor had neither the temperament nor the capability required to govern a vast and unstable kingdom. Chroniclers described him as gentle, deeply religious, and uninterested in the mechanics of power. While these qualities might have suited a monk, they were disastrous for a monarch presiding over an empire still recovering from trauma. Real authority quickly shifted to Fedor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Godunov had risen through the ranks during Ivan's reign, proving himself a capable administrator and political strategist. Under Fedor's nominal rule, he effectively governed the country as regent. In many ways, Godunov's administration attempted to repair the damage left by Ivan's final years. He strengthened border defenses, encouraged colonization in newly conquered territories, and continued the expansion eastward into Siberia. Russian explorers and Cossack adventurers pushed across the Ural Mountains, establishing forts and trade routes that would eventually extend to the Pacific Ocean. Yet despite these achievements, Godunov faced a persistent problem. His legitimacy was fragile. The Russian political tradition had long been tied to dynastic continuity. The ruling house of Rurik, which traced its lineage back to the legendary Varangian prince who had founded the early Rus state, still commanded symbolic authority. When Tsar Fedor I died in 1598 without leaving an heir, the Rurikid dynasty came to an end after more than 7 centuries. The extinction of this ancient line created a vacuum that Russia had never before experienced. For the first time in its history, the throne had no obvious successor. In response, a national assembly known as the Zemsky Sabor convened to decide the future of the state. After deliberation, the assembly elected Boris Godunov as Tsar. His elevation represented a remarkable shift. For centuries, Russian rulers had inherited power through dynastic succession. Now the throne had been granted through political consensus. Godunov's coronation marked a new experiment in Russian governance, yet the circumstances surrounding his rise left many suspicious. Rumors circulated that Godunov had played a role in the mysterious death of Ivan IV's youngest son, Dmitry, who had died under unclear circumstances years earlier. Though no definitive proof existed, the whispers eroded Godunov's legitimacy. These doubts might have faded with time, but fate intervened. Beginning in 1601, a series of catastrophic harvest failures struck Russia. Unusually cold weather and heavy rains devastated crops across the countryside. The result was famine on a scale rarely seen in Russian history. For 3 consecutive years, food shortages spread across the land. Grain prices skyrocketed. Peasants abandoned their villages in search of survival. Starving populations flooded into cities like Moscow, overwhelming the capacity of authorities to provide relief. Chroniclers described scenes of desperation. People scavenged for roots and bark. Families collapsed in the streets. Cannibalism was whispered about in some regions. Godunov attempted to alleviate the crisis by distributing grain from state reserves and suspending certain taxes. But the scale of the disaster overwhelmed these efforts. By some estimates, hundreds of thousands perished. The famine did more than cause suffering. It destroyed confidence in the government. In the minds of many Russians, divine punishment seemed the only explanation for such catastrophe. And if God had withdrawn his favor from the land, perhaps the Tsar himself was to blame. Rebellion began to simmer. Into this atmosphere of despair and uncertainty stepped a mysterious figure. In 1603, a man appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth claiming to be Dmitri, the long-dead son of Ivan the Terrible. According to his story, he had miraculously survived the assassination attempt years earlier and had been living in hiding. Now he had returned to claim his rightful throne. Historians would later label him the first false Dmitri. But at the time, many were willing to believe his claim. Russia's political instability, combined with widespread dissatisfaction with Godunov's rule, made the appearance of a supposed legitimate heir deeply appealing. Polish nobles and Catholic clergy saw an opportunity. If the pretender could seize power, Russia might fall under the influence of Poland and possibly even embrace Catholicism. With their support, false Dmitri assembled a small army and marched toward Russia. His campaign quickly gained momentum. Discontented nobles and peasants joined his forces. Cities along the frontier opened their gates. As the pretender advanced, Godunov struggled to maintain control. Then, in April 1605, Boris Godunov died suddenly. His death transformed the political landscape overnight. Without his leadership, the government collapsed. Godunov's young son briefly attempted to claim the throne, but was soon overthrown and killed by rival factions. In June 1605, false Dmitri entered Moscow in triumph. He was crowned Tsar. For a moment, it appeared as though the pretender had achieved the impossible. Yet his reign quickly unraveled. Many Russian nobles viewed him with suspicion, believing him to be an impostor manipulated by Polish interests. His openness toward Catholic advisors and foreign allies deepened these fears. The final spark came during his marriage to a Polish noblewoman, Marina Mniszek. Her arrival in Moscow, accompanied by Catholic clergy and foreign retainers, alarmed the Orthodox establishment. Only 11 months after his coronation, false Dmitri was overthrown in a violent coup. In May 1606, conspirators stormed the Kremlin. The pretender was killed, his body mutilated and displayed to the public before being burned. But his death did not restore stability. Instead, it opened the door to even greater chaos. A new ruler, Vasily Shuisky, seized the throne, but his authority was weak and contested. Soon another pretender appeared claiming to be the miraculously surviving Dmitri. This second false Dmitri gathered supporters and established a rival court outside Moscow. Russia now had 2 competing governments. Civil war spread across the land. Foreign powers saw opportunity in the disorder. Polish forces intervened directly, supporting factions that favored their influence. Sweden entered the conflict as well, backing opposing groups in hopes of expanding its own territory. The situation deteriorated further when Polish troops occupied Moscow itself in 1610. The Kremlin fell under foreign control. For the first time in its history, Russia's capital had been seized by an outside power. Many feared that the Russian state might cease to exist altogether. Yet in moments of extreme crisis, unexpected forces sometimes emerge. Across the country, ordinary Russians began organizing resistance. Merchants, peasants, clergy, and minor nobles united in a movement to liberate their homeland. One of the leaders of this resistance was Kuzma Minin, a merchant from the city of Nizhny Novgorod. Minin called upon citizens to contribute money and manpower to form a national army. Leadership of the military campaign fell to Prince Dmitry Pozharsky. Together, they assembled a volunteer force dedicated to driving foreign occupiers from Moscow. In 1612, their army marched toward the capital. After fierce fighting, the resistance forces succeeded in expelling the Polish garrison from the Kremlin. The liberation of Moscow marked a turning point. The time of troubles, as the era would later be known, had nearly destroyed the Russian state, but the victory of the national militia restored hope. The country still needed a ruler capable of rebuilding order. In 1613, representatives from across Russia gathered once again in a Zemsky Sabor to choose a new czar. Their decision would shape the future of the nation for the next 3 centuries. They selected a 16-year-old boy from a noble but relatively modest family. His name was Mikhail Romanov. With his election, a new dynasty began. The Romanovs would rule Russia for more than 300 years. But the empire they inherited was wounded, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies. Rebuilding it would require patience, discipline, and a vision capable of guiding Russia out of chaos. The long Romanov era had begun. When the Zemsky Sabor elected 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov as Tsar in 1613, the decision was less about ambition than survival. Russia had endured more than a decade of chaos during the time of troubles. Foreign armies had occupied the capital. Pretenders had claimed the throne. Famine, rebellion, and civil war had shattered the political order that once held the state together. What the nation required now was not conquest or grandeur. It needed stability. Mikhail Romanov represented precisely that. His family belonged to the Russian nobility, but had not been deeply entangled in the brutal factional struggles of the previous years. His father, Filaret Romanov, was a respected cleric within the Orthodox Church who had spent years in Polish captivity during the turmoil. The Romanovs were acceptable to many competing factions because they were not powerful enough to threaten them. Ironically, that weakness became their greatest strength. When Mikhail arrived in Moscow to assume the throne, the capital still bore scars of occupation and war. The Kremlin's walls had witnessed siege and betrayal. The population remained wary of political authority after years of deception and violence. The new Tsar began his reign cautiously. Real power during the early years rested largely in the hands of advisors and the church leadership, particularly after Filaret returned from captivity in 1619 and effectively governed alongside his son. Father and son worked together to rebuild the institutions of the state. Their priorities were straightforward: restore order, stabilize the economy, and defend the borders of a country still vulnerable to foreign aggression. Diplomacy played a crucial role. Russia negotiated treaties with Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to end ongoing conflicts. Though these agreements required territorial concessions, they bought something more valuable: peace. With external threats temporarily reduced, the Romanov government could begin repairing the internal damage caused by the time of troubles. Reconstruction unfolded slowly. Administrative structures were re-established across the provinces. Taxes were reorganized to rebuild state revenues. Military forces were restructured to ensure that the chaos of rival armies and private militias would not return. Yet beneath these efforts lay a deeper transformation taking place within Russian society. The 17th century saw the gradual tightening of the relationship between peasants and landowners. Even before the time of troubles, restrictions on peasant mobility had begun to appear in legal codes. Now, faced with labor shortages and economic instability, the government moved to solidify these restrictions. Landowners demanded guarantees that peasants would remain tied to their estates. The state, eager to maintain agricultural productivity and tax stability, agreed. In 1649, a comprehensive law code known as the Sobornoye Ulazhenie formalized these arrangements. This legislation effectively established full serfdom across much of Russia. Peasants were permanently bound to the land and to the authority of their landlords. Runaways could be pursued indefinitely. The system ensured economic stability for the elite, but imposed severe limitations on the rural population, which formed the overwhelming majority of Russian society. Serfdom would become one of the defining features of the Russian social order for centuries to come. While domestic policies strengthened central authority, Russia's vast frontier continued expanding. Beyond the Ural Mountains stretched the immense wilderness of Siberia. For generations, explorers, traders, and Cossack adventurers had ventured into these lands seeking furs and opportunity. Under Romanov rule, this expansion accelerated dramatically. Small detachments of Cossacks established forts along river systems that served as natural highways across the continent. Indigenous tribes were often required to pay tribute in furs, which became a major source of wealth for the Russian state. By the mid-17th century, Russian explorers had crossed thousands of miles of forests, rivers, and tundra. In 1639, they reached the Pacific Ocean. Within decades, they established settlements along the Amur River and even crossed into what is now Alaska. The speed of this expansion was astonishing. In less than a century, Russia had grown into a transcontinental empire. Yet governing such vast territory presented immense challenges. Communication across these distances required months. Local officials wielded enormous autonomy. Maintaining authority demanded a delicate balance between central control and regional flexibility. Meanwhile, social tensions within the core regions of Russia began rising. The expansion of serfdom placed heavy burdens on peasants, who faced increasing obligations to their landlords. Taxes and military conscription added further pressure. Occasional uprisings broke out across the countryside. One of the most significant rebellions occurred in the 1660s and early 1670s under the leadership of a Cossack named Stenka Razin. Razin attracted thousands of followers, including runaway serfs, discontented Cossacks, and marginalized peasants. His movement combined elements of rebellion, banditry, and social protest. Razin's forces captured towns along the Volga River and threatened the stability of the state before eventually being defeated by government troops. He was executed in Moscow in 1671. Though the rebellion failed, it revealed the deep frustrations simmering beneath Russia's rigid social hierarchy. At the same time, the Orthodox Church faced its own internal crisis. In the 1650s, Patriarch Nikon attempted to reform religious practices within the Church to align them more closely with Greek Orthodox traditions. These changes included alterations to liturgical texts and ritual practices that had been followed for generations. For many believers, the reform seemed like an attack on sacred traditions. Opposition coalesced into a movement known as the Old Believers. They rejected Nikon's reforms and insisted on preserving the earlier forms of worship. The resulting schism divided Russian society. Old Believers were persecuted by authorities and often forced into remote regions where they maintained their traditions in isolation. This religious conflict further complicated the task of maintaining unity within the expanding empire. Despite these challenges, the Romanov dynasty gradually strengthened its hold on power. Successive rulers built upon the administrative structures created in the aftermath of the time of troubles. Territorial expansion continued. Trade networks developed along river systems linking the interior of Russia to European markets. Moscow remained the political and spiritual center of the realm. Yet compared to Western Europe, Russia remained relatively isolated. During the 17th century, European powers such as England, France, and the Dutch Republic experienced profound transformations in science, commerce, and political organization. Naval empires expanded across oceans. Technological innovation accelerated. Urban centers flourished. Russia, by contrast, remained largely rural and agrarian. Its political system emphasized centralized authority and social hierarchy rather than commercial dynamism. The gap between Russia and Western Europe began widening. Some members of the Russian elite recognized this growing disparity. They understood that without modernization, the state might struggle to compete with emerging European powers. Among those who recognized the urgency of reform was a young prince born in 1672. His childhood unfolded within the royal court of the Romanov dynasty, surrounded by both traditional Russian culture and glimpses of foreign influence. From an early age, he displayed unusual curiosity about technology, military organization, and shipbuilding. Unlike many previous rulers, he did not view foreign knowledge with suspicion. Instead, he sought it out. This young prince would grow into a ruler determined to transform Russia through sweeping reforms. His ambition would reshape the military, the government, and even the culture of the Russian elite. He would build a new capital city on the shores of the Baltic Sea and drag Russia onto the stage of European power. History would remember him as Peter the Great. His reign would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Russia's long struggle to define its place between East and West. When Peter Alexeyevich Romanov was born in 1672, Russia was already one of the largest states on Earth. Its territory stretched across forests, rivers, and steppes that extended thousands of miles eastward into Siberia. Yet despite its size, the country remained politically and technologically behind many European powers. The army relied heavily on outdated tactics. The navy barely existed. Government administration was slow and inefficient. The Russian elite remained culturally isolated from the rapid transformations reshaping Western Europe. Peter would spend his life attempting to change that reality, but his path to power began in turmoil. When Peter's father, Tsar Alexei, died in 1676, succession disputes erupted within the Romanov family. Rival factions supported different heirs, and court politics became increasingly volatile. After several years of intrigue, Peter and his half-brother Ivan V were declared co-czars in 1682. Yet real authority rested with their older sister, Sophia, who served as regent. Sophia proved to be an intelligent and capable ruler, but her position depended on fragile alliances among powerful boyar families and the elite military units known as the Streltsy. Peter spent much of his youth outside the formal structures of government. This unusual upbringing would shape his worldview. Instead of being confined to ceremonial court life, Peter developed practical interests. He became fascinated with mechanical devices, weapons, navigation, and shipbuilding. In the suburbs of Moscow, he assembled groups of young companions who participated in mock military exercises. These activities eventually evolved into training regiments that later formed the foundation of Russia's modern army. Peter's curiosity extended beyond Russia's borders. Foreign merchants, engineers, and soldiers had established small communities in Moscow, particularly in an area known as the German Quarter. There Peter encountered Western European culture firsthand. He observed foreign clothing, languages, technologies, and military methods. The experience convinced him that Russia needed dramatic reform, but before he could implement such changes, he had to seize full control of the throne. In 1689, tensions between Peter and his sister Sophia erupted into open conflict. Both sides sought support from military forces and noble factions. The confrontation ended with Sophia's removal from power. She was confined to a convent, and Peter became the dominant ruler, though his co-czar Ivan V technically remained on the throne until his death in 1696. With his authority secured, Peter began pursuing the ambitions that had been forming during his youth. One of his earliest objectives was gaining access to warm-water ports. Russia's geography presented a major strategic limitation. Much of its coastline lay along the Arctic Ocean, where ports froze during winter months. This severely restricted maritime trade and naval development. To become a major European power, Russia needed reliable access to the seas. Peter initially focused on the south. The Ottoman Empire controlled territories along the Black Sea, including the fortress of Azov. In 1695, Peter launched a campaign to capture it. The first attempt failed, but Peter learned quickly from defeat. He ordered the construction of a fleet to support a second assault. Shipyards were established along the Don River, and within a year, Russian forces returned with a coordinated land and naval attack. In 1696, Azov fell. For the first time, Russia possessed a foothold on the Black Sea. Yet Peter understood that deeper reforms were necessary if Russia was to compete with established European powers. In 1697, he embarked on an extraordinary journey known as the Grand Embassy. Traveling incognito across Europe, Peter visited the Dutch Republic, England, and several German states. He studied shipbuilding techniques in Dutch shipyards. He observed military drills and government institutions. He recruited foreign specialists willing to serve in Russia. The trip exposed Peter to the technological and organizational advances transforming Europe. But it also reinforced his determination to reshape Russian society according to what he had seen. When Peter returned to Russia in 1698, he began implementing reforms with relentless energy. The changes touched nearly every aspect of life. The military became his first priority. Peter reorganized the army along Western lines, introducing standardized training, modern artillery, and disciplined command structures. The Streltsy units that had supported earlier political factions were disbanded after a rebellion in 1698, their members executed or exiled. In their place emerged a professional standing army loyal directly to the Tsar. Peter also created Russia's first true navy. Shipyards were constructed, naval academies established, and officers trained in maritime strategy. The navy would soon become one of the central instruments of Russian expansion. Administrative reforms followed. Peter reorganized the government into specialized departments known as colleges, each responsible for specific areas such as finance, foreign affairs, and military administration. A new ranking system called the Table of Ranks redefined the structure of the nobility. Under this system, advancement depended not solely on birth, but on service to the state. This change weakened the traditional power of hereditary aristocrats and strengthened the authority of the central government. Peter's reforms extended beyond politics and military affairs. He sought to reshape Russian culture itself. Western-style clothing was introduced at court. Nobles were ordered to shave their traditional beards or pay taxes to keep them. New schools were established to teach mathematics, engineering, and navigation. Printing presses expanded the availability of books and newspapers. Even the calendar was altered to align more closely with European systems. These changes shocked many members of the traditional elite. To them, Peter's reforms appeared as an assault on Russian identity. But Peter believed modernization was essential for survival in a rapidly changing world. While reforms transformed internal structures, Peter also pursued expansion abroad. His greatest conflict emerged with Sweden. At the beginning of the 18th century, Sweden was one of the dominant powers in northern Europe. Its territories surrounded much of the Baltic Sea, limiting Russia's access to vital maritime routes. In 1700, Peter joined a coalition of states determined to challenge Swedish dominance. The resulting conflict became known as the Great Northern War. The war began disastrously for Russia. At the Battle of Narva in 1700, Swedish forces under the young King Charles XII crushed Peter's army. Yet the defeat did not discourage Peter. Instead, it reinforced his commitment to military reform. Over the following years, he rebuilt the Russian army, trained new officers, and expanded his navy. As Sweden focused its campaigns elsewhere in Europe, Peter seized the opportunity to capture territory along the Baltic coast. In 1703, he founded a new city on the marshy delta of the Neva River. The location was harsh and inhospitable. Floods threatened construction. Thousands of laborers died building fortifications and canals. Yet Peter insisted that the city would become Russia's window to Europe. He named it St. Petersburg. Over time, the city grew into a symbol of Peter's vision. European-style architecture replaced medieval fortresses. Shipyards and trading ports flourished. Eventually, the capital of Russia itself moved from Moscow to the new city. Meanwhile, the Great Northern War continued. The decisive moment arrived in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. Peter's modernized army confronted Charles XII's Swedish forces in one of the largest battles of the era. After hours of brutal combat, the Swedish army collapsed. The victory transformed the balance of power in Northern Europe. Sweden's dominance faded. Russia emerged as a major European power. The war continued for several more years, but the outcome was already clear. By the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, Russia secured significant Baltic territories and permanent access to the sea. Peter celebrated the victory by adopting a new title. He declared himself Emperor of all Russia. The transformation was complete. Russia was no longer an isolated Eastern kingdom. It had become an empire. Yet Peter's achievements came at enormous cost. Taxes increased to fund military campaigns and construction projects. Forced labor built cities and shipyards. Many reforms were imposed through harsh discipline and brutal enforcement. When Peter the Great died in 1725, he left behind a transformed state. Russia possessed a modern army and navy. Its administrative system had been reorganized. Its cultural orientation had shifted toward Europe, and its influence on the continent had grown dramatically. But the question remained whether the empire he built could survive without the force of his personality driving it forward. The decades following his death would test the stability of Peter's legacy. The empire had been born. Now it would struggle to define its future. When Peter the Great died in 1725, the empire he left behind was stronger than any Russian state that had existed before it. The military had been modernized, the bureaucracy reorganized, and Russia had secured a powerful position on the Baltic Sea. St. Petersburg stood as a gleaming symbol of the new imperial order, a city built not only of stone and canals, but of Peter's relentless determination to transform his country. Yet the empire Peter created also carried a dangerous flaw. He had reshaped Russia's institutions with extraordinary force, but he had failed to establish a stable system of succession. The result was nearly 4 decades of political instability following his death. Peter's immediate successor was his wife, Catherine I. Her rise to power demonstrated how profoundly the structure of Russian politics had changed under Peter's reforms. Catherine had not been born into royalty. She began life as a peasant of obscure origin before rising through the ranks of Peter's court. Her elevation to the throne in 1725 revealed the growing influence of powerful court factions and military leaders who now played decisive roles in determining the succession. Catherine's reign lasted only 2 years. After her death in 1727, the throne passed to Peter II, the grandson of Peter the Great. But the young ruler died suddenly in 1730, leaving the Romanov dynasty once again without a clear heir. The Russian nobility attempted to seize this opportunity to limit the power of the monarchy. When they invited Anna Ivanovna, a niece of Peter the Great, to assume the throne, they initially demanded that she accept constitutional restrictions on her authority. For a brief moment, Russia appeared on the verge of developing a more limited form of monarchy. But Anna had little interest in sharing power. Shortly after arriving in Moscow, she dramatically tore up the documents that would have restricted her rule. Autocracy remained intact. Anna's reign from 1730 to 1740 was marked by the growing influence of foreign advisors, particularly Germans who occupied many important administrative positions. This period became known among critics as the Baronovshchina, referring to Ernst Johann von Bayern, one of Anna's closest confidants. Though many reforms from Peter's era continued, resentment grew among Russian nobles who feared that foreign influence had become excessive. Anna's death triggered another succession crisis. Her chosen heir was an infant, Ivan VI, whose regency quickly collapsed under the pressure of palace intrigue. In 1741, a dramatic coup placed Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, on the throne. Elizabeth's rise restored a sense of continuity with Peter's legacy. Her reign lasted more than 2 decades and represented a period of relative stability compared with the turbulent years that had preceded it. Elizabeth strongly embraced the cultural transformations initiated by her father. St. Petersburg flourished as the center of imperial life. Baroque architecture reshaped the city's skyline, with magnificent palaces and cathedrals rising along its canals. Elizabeth also promoted education and intellectual development. In 1755, the Moscow University was established, becoming one of the most important centers of learning in Russia. Yet despite these cultural achievements, Russia's political system remained deeply autocratic. The emperor or empress held nearly absolute authority. The nobility maintained its privileges, while serfdom continued binding millions of peasants to the land. Russia had become an empire, but it was still a society defined by rigid hierarchy. Elizabeth's foreign policy further strengthened Russia's position in Europe. During the 7 Years' War, one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century, Russian armies fought against Prussia under Frederick the Great. Russian forces achieved significant victories and even occupied Berlin briefly in 1760. For a moment it appeared as though Prussia might collapse entirely, but history turned on a sudden event. Elizabeth died in 1762. Her successor, Peter III, was an admirer of Frederick the Great. Within months he withdrew Russia from the war and returned conquered territories. The decision shocked the Russian military and nobility. Peter III's policies quickly alienated many powerful figures within the empire. His reign lasted only 6 months. In July 1762, he was overthrown in a coup led by his own wife. Her name was Catherine. Catherine II would become one of the most famous rulers in Russian history. Known to later generations as Catherine the Great, she embodied the contradictions of the Russian Empire during the Enlightenment era. Born in 1729 as a minor German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, she arrived in Russia as a teenager to marry the future Peter III. Determined to secure her place in Russian society, she embraced the language, religion, and customs of her adopted homeland. Over time, she built strong alliances within the court and military. When the opportunity arose, she acted decisively. Peter III was forced to abdicate and died shortly afterward under mysterious circumstances. Catherine ascended the throne as empress. Her reign would last 34 years. Catherine was deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. She corresponded with leading European thinkers such as Voltaire and Denis Diderot. She believed that Russia could modernize through reason, education, and administrative reform. Yet she also understood the realities of ruling a vast autocratic empire. Balancing these ideals with political necessity became the central challenge of her reign. Early in her rule, Catherine attempted to reform Russia's legal system. In 1767, she convened a legislative commission tasked with drafting a new law code. Her instruction, or nakaz, outlined principles influenced by Enlightenment thought, including ideas about equality before the law and rational governance. But the commission ultimately failed to produce a new code. Russia's complex social hierarchy made sweeping legal reform difficult. Despite this setback, Catherine continued strengthening the administrative structure of the empire. She reorganized provincial governments, expanded bureaucratic oversight, and encouraged economic development. Trade increased as new towns and infrastructure projects connected distant regions of the empire. At the same time, Russia's territorial expansion accelerated dramatically. One of Catherine's most significant geopolitical achievements involved the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Russian armies pushed southward, securing victories that expanded access to the Black Sea. In 1783, Russia annexed Crimea, gaining a strategic foothold that would shape regional politics for centuries. Even more dramatic were the partitions of Poland. During the late 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth weakened under internal divisions and foreign pressure. Russia, Prussia, and Austria gradually divided Polish territory among themselves in a series of partitions beginning in 1772. By 1795, Poland had disappeared entirely from the map of Europe. Russia acquired enormous territories and millions of new subjects. The empire now stretched deep into Eastern Europe, yet Catherine's reign was not without crisis. In 1773, a massive rebellion erupted across southern Russia. It was led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Tsar Peter III. His uprising attracted tens of thousands of followers, including discontented peasants, Cossacks, and oppressed ethnic groups. Pugachev's forces captured cities and threatened imperial authority across the Volga region before finally being defeated. The rebellion terrified the Russian elite. It revealed how fragile the social order remained. In response, Catherine strengthened the privileges of the nobility, granting them greater authority over their serfs. This decision ensured political stability among the ruling class, but deepened the hardships faced by the peasantry. Despite such contradictions, Catherine's reign represented a golden age of imperial power. Russian culture flourished. Literature, art, and architecture developed rapidly. St. Petersburg became one of Europe's great capitals. When Catherine the Great died in 1796, Russia stood as one of the most powerful states in Europe. Its territory had expanded enormously. Its military influence shaped continental politics. Yet beneath the surface of imperial glory lay unresolved tensions. Serfdom still dominated rural life. Autocratic rule suppressed political dissent, and the rapid changes sweeping through Europe, revolutions, new political ideas, and industrial transformation, were beginning to challenge the old order. The empire Catherine left behind appeared strong, but the century ahead would test its foundations more severely than any period since the time of troubles. When Catherine the Great died in 1796, the Russian Empire stretched farther than ever before. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the forests of Poland to the distant rivers of Siberia, the empire had become one of the dominant powers of Europe. Yet the grandeur of Catherine's reign masked deep contradictions within Russian society. The empire's political system remained firmly rooted in autocracy. The nobility possessed enormous privileges, and millions of peasants remained bound to the land under the harsh institution of serfdom. These tensions would define the next century of Russian history. Catherine's son, Paul I, inherited the throne but not his mother's popularity. Paul had spent much of his life overshadowed by Catherine, who never trusted him with real authority. Years of exclusion fostered resentment and suspicion. When he finally became emperor, Paul sought to reverse many of the policies associated with his mother's reign. He tightened discipline within the military and attempted to reduce some of the privileges enjoyed by the nobility. He also issued a decree limiting the number of days per week that serfs could be required to work for their landlords. Though modest, these measures alarmed many members of the aristocracy. Paul's unpredictable personality further destabilized his rule. His erratic behavior and frequent policy reversals alienated both the nobility and the military. In 1801, a group of conspirators entered his palace in St. Petersburg and assassinated him. The coup elevated his son, Alexander I, to the throne. Alexander began his reign with hopes of reform. Educated by tutors influenced by Enlightenment ideas, he believed that Russia might gradually modernize its political system. Early in his rule, he introduced administrative reforms and considered proposals for a constitution. Yet the greatest challenge of his reign emerged from beyond Russia's borders. Across Europe, the French Revolution had shattered the old political order. From its chaos rose a military leader whose ambitions threatened every established monarchy. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. By the early 19th century, Napoleon had conquered much of continental Europe and established a vast empire under French domination. Russia initially alternated between opposing and cooperating with Napoleon, but tensions inevitably escalated. In 1812, Napoleon launched one of the largest military campaigns in history. His grand army, consisting of more than 500,000 soldiers drawn from across Europe, marched eastward toward Russia. Napoleon expected a decisive campaign that would force Russia back into submission. Instead, he encountered a strategy that would become legendary. Russian forces under General Mikhail Kutuzov avoided large-scale engagements during the early stages of the invasion. As they retreated deeper into the country, they adopted a scorched-earth strategy, destroying crops and supplies that might aid the advancing French army. Napoleon's forces captured the city of Smolensk and eventually approached Moscow. The decisive battle occurred near the village of Borodino in September 1812. It was one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in brutal combat. Though Napoleon's army technically held the battlefield, the Russian forces withdrew in good order. The road to Moscow lay open. When Napoleon entered the ancient capital days later, he expected the city's surrender to bring the war to a close. Instead, he found Moscow largely abandoned. Soon fires erupted across the city. Whether accidental or deliberate, the flames consumed vast sections of Moscow, leaving little shelter or supplies for the occupying army. Napoleon waited for a peace negotiation that never came. As winter approached and supplies dwindled, the French emperor was forced to order a retreat. The withdrawal became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Harsh weather, hunger, disease, and relentless attacks by Russian forces decimated the once mighty Grand Army. Only a fraction of Napoleon's soldiers escaped the campaign alive. The invasion's failure transformed Russia's international standing. Russian armies pursued the retreating French forces across Europe. In 1814, they entered Paris itself, helping to bring Napoleon's empire to an end. Russia emerged from the conflict as a central power in European politics. Yet victory abroad did not resolve tensions at home. Russian officers who had marched across Europe during the war encountered new political ideas. They observed constitutional governments, legal reforms, and societies that operated differently from Russia's rigid autocracy. Many returned home questioning whether similar reforms might be possible in their own country. These questions erupted into rebellion in December 1825. When Alexander I died unexpectedly, confusion surrounded the succession. A group of reform-minded officers seized the moment. They organized an uprising in St. Petersburg, hoping to force the new ruler to accept constitutional limits on his authority. The rebellion became known as the Decembrist Revolt, but the uprising failed. Nicholas I, Alexander's younger brother, quickly asserted control. Loyal troops dispersed the rebels, and the leaders of the movement were executed or exiled to Siberia. Nicholas I emerged from the crisis determined to prevent further challenges to autocratic rule. His reign, which lasted from 1825 to 1855, emphasized strict discipline, censorship, and centralized authority. Nicholas believed that Russia's stability depended upon three pillars: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. These principles became the ideological foundation of his government. While the empire maintained strong military power, its internal development lagged behind Western Europe. Industrialization progressed slowly. Serfdom continued to dominate the rural economy. By the mid-19th century, these weaknesses became increasingly apparent. The turning point arrived during the Crimean War. In 1853, Russia entered a conflict against the Ottoman Empire that soon expanded into a wider war involving Britain and France. The conflict exposed serious deficiencies in Russia's military organization, technology, and infrastructure. Allied forces eventually besieged the strategic port of Sevastopol in Crimea. After nearly a year of fighting, the city fell in 1855. The defeat shocked the Russian leadership. It demonstrated that despite its vast territory and large army, the empire had fallen behind its rivals in modernization. Nicholas I died during the war, leaving his son Alexander II to confront the consequences. Alexander recognized that fundamental reform was necessary. The most pressing issue remained serfdom. By the mid-19th century, millions of peasants remained legally bound to landowners. The system hindered economic development and fueled social unrest. In 1861, Alexander II issued the Emancipation Edict, freeing more than 20 million serfs. The reform was one of the most significant social transformations in Russian history. Yet, emancipation did not resolve all problems. Many peasants received limited land and were required to make redemption payments to former landlords. Economic hardship continued in many rural regions. Alexander II introduced additional reforms, including judicial modernization, local government institutions known as zemstvos, and military restructuring. These changes represented an attempt to modernize the empire while preserving the monarchy. But reform also encouraged political activism. Radical groups began demanding deeper transformations, including constitutional government. Some turned to violence. In 1880, one member of a revolutionary organization assassinated Alexander II in St. Petersburg. His death marked a turning point. His successor, Alexander III, abandoned many reformist policies and returned to strict autocratic rule. The empire entered the final decades of the 19th century facing mounting pressures. Industrialization was accelerating, especially in cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. A growing working class demanded better conditions. Nationalist movements emerged among minority populations within the empire. Political activists organized underground movements calling for revolution. The Russian Empire remained vast and powerful, but beneath its surface, forces of change were gathering. Within a generation, those forces would erupt into revolutions that would end centuries of imperial rule. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire appeared immense, formidable, and ancient. It stretched across 11 time zones, encompassing forests, mountains, steppes, and frozen tundra. More than 100 million people lived within its borders, speaking dozens of languages and practicing multiple religions. Yet beneath this enormous surface lay a fragile structure. The empire remained governed by an autocratic system that had changed little since the days of Ivan the Terrible. The emperor, now known as the Tsar, held near absolute authority. Political dissent was suppressed. Serfdom had been abolished only decades earlier, leaving deep economic and social tensions unresolved. At the same time, industrialization was accelerating. Factories expanded in cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow. Railways stretched across the empire, linking distant regions. A new urban working class began emerging alongside traditional peasant communities. These transformations created a society caught between two eras. The old imperial order still dominated politics, while modern economic forces reshaped everyday life. When Nicholas II became Tsar in 1894, he inherited this volatile system. Nicholas believed deeply in the divine authority of monarchy. Like many rulers before him, he saw autocracy not as a political choice, but as a sacred duty entrusted by God. Yet his reign would unfold during one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history. The first major crisis came from abroad. In 1904, Russia entered war with Japan over competing ambitions in East Asia, particularly in Manchuria and Korea. Many Russian leaders assumed victory would come easily against what they viewed as a lesser power. They were wrong. Japanese forces proved highly disciplined and technologically capable. In a series of stunning defeats, Russia's army and navy were overwhelmed. The destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 shocked the world. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a major European empire in large-scale warfare. The humiliation intensified domestic unrest. Economic hardship, political repression, and anger over the war created explosive conditions within Russian society. On January 22, 1905, thousands of workers marched peacefully through St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. Led by a priest named Father Georgy Gapon, they intended to present a petition to the Tsar requesting improved working conditions and political reforms. Instead, they encountered armed soldiers. The troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. Hundreds of civilians were killed or wounded. The massacre shattered public faith in the monarchy. Across the empire, strikes, protests, and uprisings erupted. Railways stopped running. Factories closed. Peasant revolts spread through the countryside. Facing mounting pressure, Nicholas II agreed to limited reforms. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the creation of a representative assembly known as the Duma. For the first time, Russia appeared to be moving toward constitutional government. Yet the reforms remained incomplete. The Tsar retained significant authority and frequently dismissed Duma assemblies that challenged his policies. Political instability persisted. Meanwhile, revolutionary movements continued organizing underground. Among them was a radical socialist faction led by a determined revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin. His group, known as the Bolsheviks, believed that only a violent revolution could overthrow the autocratic system and establish a socialist state. While internal tensions simmered, the empire faced another external crisis. In 1914, Europe descended into the First World War. Russia entered the conflict as part of an alliance with France and Britain against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Initially, patriotic enthusiasm swept through the country. But the war quickly exposed Russia's weaknesses. The army suffered enormous casualties. Poor logistics and inadequate equipment crippled military operations. By 1916, millions of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. At home, the economy struggled to support the war effort. Food shortages became common in major cities. Inflation soared. Public frustration grew. Nicholas II made a disastrous decision in 1915 by assuming personal command of the army. While he remained at the front, political authority in the capital weakened. His wife, Empress Alexandra, relied heavily on the advice of a controversial mystic named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence over the royal family sparked scandal and distrust among the political elite. In December 1916, a group of nobles assassinated Rasputin, hoping to save the monarchy's reputation. But the damage had already been done. In early 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, the name St. Petersburg had adopted during the war. Workers demanded bread. Soldiers stationed in the city began refusing orders. Within days, the demonstrations escalated into a full-scale uprising. The February Revolution had begun. Nicholas II found himself isolated. Military leaders advised him that resistance was impossible. In March 1917, the Tsar abdicated the throne. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries, came to an end. A provisional government attempted to establish democratic institutions. Yet it faced enormous challenges. The war continued draining resources and morale. Workers' councils known as Soviets emerged as alternative centers of power. Political factions competed for influence in an atmosphere of uncertainty. Amid this turmoil, the Bolsheviks seized their opportunity. Under Lenin's leadership, they called for immediate peace, land redistribution, and the transfer of power to the Soviets. Their message resonated with soldiers, workers, and peasants exhausted by war and hardship. In October 1917, Bolshevik forces launched a carefully planned coup in Petrograd. They seized key government buildings and arrested members of the provisional government. The Bolshevik Revolution had succeeded. Russia's centuries-old imperial system collapsed, but revolution did not bring immediate stability. A brutal civil war erupted between the Bolsheviks, now known as the Red Army, and a coalition of opposing forces called the Whites. Foreign powers intervened, hoping to prevent the spread of communist revolution. For several years, the country descended into chaos. Eventually, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. In 1922, they established a new political entity, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Russian Empire had vanished. In its place arose a revolutionary state that would dominate much of the 20th century. Yet even after the fall of the monarchy, Russia's historical patterns endured. Centralized authority remained powerful. The state continued exercising immense control over society. The vast geography that had shaped centuries of imperial expansion still influenced politics and strategy. The empire that had once refused to die had transformed rather than disappeared. From the medieval princes of Kiev to the autocrats of the Romanov dynasty, Russia's history had been defined by cycles of expansion, crisis, and reinvention. The rise of the Soviet Union represented another chapter in that long story. Even in the modern world, echoes of the imperial past remained visible. Russia's enduring question, how to govern a vast land bridging Europe and Asia, continued shaping its destiny. Empires may collapse, dynasties may vanish, but the forces that created them often endure far beyond their fall. And in Russia's case, the empire's spirit, its resilience, ambition, and refusal to disappear, remains woven into the fabric of history.